Welcome to Wavelengths, a podcast with Amphenol Broadband Solutions.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. And folks, thanks so much for joining us on another episode of the show. We appreciate you joining us for some broadband and telecom industry thought leadership. As we explore today's topic and technologies, make sure that you're subscribing to Wavelengths on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Just hit that subscribe button and you'll have a full catalog of previous conversations as well as notifications when we drop new ones. And also make sure you're going to our website, amphenolbroadband.com. Again, amphenolbroadband.com for more information on some of the tech and trends you'll hear about today, and also for more Amphenol broadband content, including podcasts, videos, articles, and more. So on today's episode of Wavelengths, we're peering into the telecom industry's crystal ball, and we're predicting the future of connectivity networks, their technologies, breaking down some challenges and solutions, and predicting some broader industry impacts. But more specifically, we're getting an update on global 5G rollout, implementation, and installations, and then using this to frame 5G's future impact. So, here to give us some more insights is Senior VP of Amphenol and recently inducted into the Cable TV Hall of Fame, Mr. Zak Raley, who's bringing more than 25 years of telecom experience to our conversation today. Zak Raley, great to have you on. How you doing?
Great. Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate the time and look forward to joining the discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah. Real pleasure getting to chat. Looking forward to pulling from your deep experience in the space and getting a real lay of the land for how far along we are in 5G rollout, what some of the opportunities and barriers are, how this is happening at a global scale, and what we can expect moving forward. So I want to start with that 25 years in telecom. That's a long career in this industry. How does the 5G rollout compare to some other generations of network improvements that you've worked through over the years and you've seen take hold?
Sure. 5G really is a sea change of a number of technologies that are going to become inherent in the communication space. And I think the best way for those that are not familiar with it to contemplate what 5G means, it essentially is creating a massive, wide-scale, very low latency network that will connect more devices than there are people on the planet. And there are some industry estimates that talk about the interconnectedness of 25 to 40 billion devices. Obviously, with the planet population being much lower than that, it really is going to be a network of communications that will be very much all IP-based that really will interface with every aspect of everyone's daily life, whether it be in business, whether it be in education, whether it be in farming, whether it be in the automobile. It's just going to be a ubiquitous network that really takes us to the next level of communications and the interconnectedness of many, many things.
And if we look at 5G rollout, at least here in the US, and use that as I guess a metric for how far along we are, we can see that T-Mobile holds the largest and the most robust 5G network in the US. So for a little more context there, most of the US already has T-Mobile extended range 5G, and a few dense urban pockets get to boast ultra capacity 5G. So as Verizon and AT&T, the other major players here, expand their own coverage as the big three players, and then with the merger of Sprint and T-Mobile, that brought Dish Network into the picture, and they're still in the long-term process of developing their own infrastructure. How does all of this pose competition around 5G rollout? And based on how far along 5G is for T-Mobile and the other players, do you think they have a chance at matching T-Mobile's reach anytime soon?
So I think there would have to be really that true definition of 5G to answer that really expressly. But T-Mobile certainly has a timing advantage and a bit of a spectrum advantage over some of the other players. Their low band, mid band spectrum for 5G was just better optimized with what they picked up in the Sprint acquisition. And of course, depending on which industry publication you read or which company publication or presentation you read, right, there's lots of arguments about who has the most 5G. But, the reality is that 5G really is very nascent in the US. And by nascent, it's not necessarily nearly as ubiquitous as 4G or 4G enhanced. I would say that, if you had to sort of ballpark the footprint of coverage of 5G in the US in the aggregate, including the big players in the space, it probably only covers effectively about 25% of the national footprint. So there's a lot that still has to be done. It is probably more in the marketing stage in terms of the people that actually are connecting to a true 5G network. And, there's a lot of still ground to cover, I would say, in terms of that 5G rollout. Certainly with the most recent auctions in C-band, where both AT&T and Verizon picked up a lot of debt, certainly, and quite a bit of spectrum, that is going to enhance this 5G rollout much more aggressively. You mentioned in the question, the sort of the dense urban areas, ultra capacity. That we can talk a little bit about later in terms of the spectrum utilization. But, the dense urban areas, I think if you think about the impact of COVID, right, if I'm a wireless operator and, New York City has been a ghost town and, San Francisco's been a ghost town and all of these major metropolitan areas where a lot of the population really exited during COVID, there was a bit of a pause, I think, in the deployment profile. So I would say that, yes, T-Mobile certainly has a bit of a lead on this, but you'll see Verizon and AT&T really aggressively going out with their builds over the next couple of years. The new players like Dish Networks are extremely aggressive in their rollout plans. So all of this competition in 5G is really going to start getting significant here over the next bit of time. And look, the reality is, right, as 5G develops, maybe T-Mo takes a little bit from Verizon, and then Verizon takes a bit from T-Mo, and AT&T takes a bit from whoever else, and Dish comes in and takes a few more subscribers. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth over the next number of years as that 5G network really gets built out.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to be keeping my ear to the ground to see whether or not that timing advantage from T-Mobile is really going to give them an overall differentiator in the long term. And we're going to get into some of the different types of spectrum that you've already expanded on a bit, but using that as a point of contention as well for potential competition in the space. Before we do that, though, once the major players all do have comparable 5G speeds and coverage, because I think it's pretty fair to say that at least those big three, and then eventually Dish, will probably all have a significant 5G footprint. So once they're all kind of on the same playing field, where do you think the key differentiators and quality of solution will be? And how do you think this competition will then shape future technical innovation and rollouts in 5G?
Sure. I would maybe harken back a little bit to the 4G transition when we went from 3G to 4G. And that really was, what will be the killer app at the consumer level? This is not necessarily at the enterprise or the industrial level, but certainly at the consumer level, right? What is going to be the key killer app that drives utilization on 5G? As I mentioned earlier, 5G latency, which is the speed at which you can connect and communicate over the internet, and certainly then the speed of communication to the handset. In this case, mostly it will, obviously wearables and other type of applications could be in the space, but really, what is going to be that killer app that drives the need for faster communication and certainly more speed? So I envision this as really, the fastest low latency network that allows people to, in 3 to 5 years have a handset that is, on par with today's generations of gaming devices. Certainly, very dense 4K video streams, all of the over-the-top transmission of video to the handset. I think all of that is going to be very much connected to success for the operators in terms of that differentiator. So I think the lowest latency, fastest network will probably enable the next generation of high-speed killer app. And that high-speed killer app is still a little bit yet to be, I think, described. But, if you can envision today that the handset will probably be able to throughput as much content as sort of, say, an Xbox or a PlayStation does today in the next 2 to 3 years, that hooks into a virtual or an augmented reality headset, right? You're going to need a really solid connection for people to be able to use that. So that network that provides that type of service, right? That, back in the 3G world, when you drive down the road and you don't have your call drops out, people get frustrated. I think it really is going to be the robustness of the network that allows for a much bigger transition to some of those higher use type of applications. So I think the differentiator will certainly be that on the network, and which network can perform the best, which has the fastest speed, the lowest latency, the least amount of dropout, the least amount of packet loss. And then I think, and as always a question, right? Price and how much you eat at the buffet, right? I mean, if you think of yourself as a consumer, if you paid $50 a month and you got an all-you-can-eat buffet on data that was really fast, really low latency, it allowed you to use your next generation Oculus headset with your phone to go out and do whatever you want on sort of an augmented reality platform, you probably as a consumer will want that. So I think there will be some price that comes into this, and either price or, the lack of data capping. I think data capping will be a major differentiator here as time goes on. So that'll drive, I think, some of that, who will have the most successful experience as a supplier, so to speak, on 5G. And then this competition, for me, is really going to drive lots of innovation. If you think about what 4G did for us as a consumer in the North American market, certainly, all of that access to new applications, whether that be Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, YouTube videos, TikTok, right? All of that stuff was built off of the ability of that 4G network to really work. So what will it shape the next technical innovation profile? I think part of that is going to be very much dependent on what that killer app is. But I personally believe that the interface to virtual augmented reality is going to be a huge part of that. And there's lots of different iterations of what that could look like. But all of that will require quite a bit of connectivity and that high speed, low latency type of network that will happen in the space.
Expanding on some of the different spectrum options for 5G, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, it's hard to answer questions about, how can XYZ company compete against XYZ other company with their 5G offerings without identifying that there are different levels of 5G that are being rolled out all simultaneously, and they all provide different use cases and are being leveraged differently in the rollout. So I want to break those down more. There's 3 key types of spectrum right now that are being utilized. We've got low band, and that's 5G for long distances usually. There's millimeter wave spectrum. That's going to give supercharged speed, but for considerably shorter distances than low band. And then there's a mid-band spectrum, which right now T-Mobile is really maximizing its scale, and they're one of the few that are doing that in the US. And this is supposed to be a compromise of distance and speed. So with these 3 key types of spectrum, do you think that these 3 will continue to make up a larger 5G ecosystem of various types of 5G spectrum? Or as 5G deployments get more robust, do you think one spectrum will take over most of the data flow for any particular reason?
So it's a great question. I think that certainly all of those types of spectrum will be continued to be used in 5G. So, the reality is that, yes, T-Mobile has certainly a bit of a lead in the mid-band, but with the recent C-band auction, certainly T-Mobile or certainly AT&T and Verizon will begin, their sort of approach in the mid-band space. They already have quite a bit of low band, but that's going to give them that really positioning on the mid-band for higher speed and not quite as much distance as, for example, a 600 megahertz signal might be. So anything that's over that 3 gig area, 2.5 to 3 gig area, gigahertz, I should say, that will be used for that mid-band. And, the reality of low band, it still can be very serviceable, not obviously as high speed, but, low band is going to be when you're driving across Kansas on I-70, probably not going to have a millimeter wave spectrum that does much for you, but, will it provide enough bandwidth for what you need to do for the self-drive car vehicle, that type of thing? Yeah, it probably will be very effective for that. So there is a lot of, I think, use case scenario for each of those spectrums. I do think that, millimeter wave tends to probably be much more applicable in a suburban and urban environment. The transmission is very sensitive to any sort of blocking in the way. I mean, you can literally look at cases and certainly other YouTube videos that have been made available online of testing data where, you can stand under a millimeter wave antenna from one of the providers, get an incredibly fast signal, walk 50 feet down the street where there's a tree, and the leaves dissipate the millimeter wave signal, and your speed drops in half, if not 3/4. So it's a very sensitive spectrum. But for certain high bandwidth urban environments where you can get better line of sight, certainly that'll be possible. So I think all three bands will continue to be very much part of that larger ecosystem. They almost have to be. And all of that, I think, will sort of gel into what 5G will really be. So you will have, variable speed in 5G where, your low band will not nearly be as high as what you get in millimeter wave, but mid-band spectrum will provide better throughput, better latency than you would get certainly in the low band. But all of those will sort of aggregate into a faster experience than what we have today. So I don't see that really shifting and changing anytime soon. I think that everyone will continue to invest in that. And all of those frequencies as they try to build this out for certain use cases and in certain environments that they exist, whether they be very rural environments, whether they be suburban, whether they be urban.
As we continue to weigh these various spectrums and rollouts from different companies and in just different areas across the U.S., what would you say are some of the most exciting business prospects of 5G connectivity as it does become more accessible? And if you wanted to get more specific, which industries stand to benefit in really holistic ways and why?
Yeah, I would honestly say that there will not be an industry that is not impacted by 5G connectivity. And, the use cases are so broad and so substantial that I would struggle to probably say that there would be an industry that does not have an impact that is not impacted by this. So, it is becoming a real focus for lots of industries. All of the major carriers have, enterprise and industrial engagement teams that are talking about putting, for example, 5G interconnectivity in highly robotic factories, putting 5G in mining operations, putting 5G in hospitals. And so I think that there really would be very few, if any, industries or even, organizations that would not be impacted by this. So, frankly, I do think that, it is going to be probably a very broad and very ubiquitous type of impact profile. And, you can almost sit back and say, you would have to probably say what things would not be impacted by 5G and start with a very small list. And, I have a very difficult time coming up with what that would be. I mean, let me use a simple example, right? So in the Pacific Northwest in the spring, there is a large number of people that go out and collect wild mushrooms. Those wild mushrooms are used in culinary, very high-end restaurants. They're very hard to find. I could see an environment where literally the person or people that go out to collect these mushrooms are feeding real-time data back to the restaurateur and bidding online in an auction format as they are in the middle of the forest. And so, rather than packing these mushrooms up, putting them in a bag and taking them on the road to go sell to restaurants, right? So it is, for me personally, I just don't see that there is not going to be every aspect of our lives and industry that's not going to be impacted by this network. It is just that transformative. And the more you read about it, the more you think about it, it becomes that ubiquity of interconnectedness that I think we got a bit of in 4G and we will see expand much more dramatically in terms of the 5G impact. So could spend probably all day on every use case you could think of there, but it is going to be pretty dramatic across almost every aspect of the world that we live in today.
And what's exciting about 5G, and potentially also a bit of a headache, is that it enables a lot of IoT launches at scale. Not that IoT isn't already maximizing 4G and just Wi-Fi connectivity, but the wholesale rollout of 5G will definitely see an increase in very robust smart integrations. And so as more companies take advantage of 5G and as more end users do as well, what kind of user experience, connectivity expectation do you think this is going to build in conjunction with some of those other IoT technologies? And how do you think this will shape or maybe place some pressure on 5G rollouts and the expectation for how the connectivity should work and to what degree it should enable, that next level of connectivity?
Sure. I would maybe again harken back to the 4G world, right? And every single time, and this applies to 3G as well, but every single time we have gone through a generational change in the wireless connectivity space, the consumer always, and there's just no data that speaks to the contrary, the consumer, and whether that be a consumer like you or I, whether that be an enterprise consumer, whether that be an industrial consumer, the consumer always finds a way to use more data. And that is just the trend that we have seen. The technology as well pipes more and more data into the devices that would be connected to this network. So my expectation, is where today on average you see utilization at the consumer level, let's just say, of 25 to 40 gigabits a month is kind of an average normal utilization profile across the U.S. today. If you take sort of the major averages, that's going to probably double or triple, and that's going to be where your wearable device on your wrist is connecting to that 5G network. It's feeding real-time health data back to the hospital, to your doctor, your physician, your clinic. It's monitoring your blood sugar levels. It's monitoring your oxygen saturation. It's advising your physician when something looks wrong. It's detecting potential, new pathogen outbreaks. There's just that this connectivity is just going to be in everything that we have. And I think because of that, that is going to push a lot of pressure on these networks to, just continue to add capacity. So, it's a multiplexing up of the utilization and the use cases of utilization of the network. And I think that will place some pressure on it as it starts to get built out. But, it will also, I think, require a lot of investment in the space for many years to come. So, it is a very strong expectation, I think, that people will have as you start to use it. I think, maybe just to put it in context, right? If you as a consumer, your connection on your phone, your data connection, not your voice connection, if your data connection on your phone stops functioning for 20 minutes, it literally is life-changing. Like, you can't do what you have expected to do, whether that's check Google Maps, whether that's, get on OpenTable to book a reservation, whether that's shop for, groceries delivered to your home. So, that expectation will be very, very high, and it will be much broader because it will be many more devices that are going to be connected to this network. And, that will shape expansion, that will shape the need to continually invest in the networks, and certainly in certain cases put pressure on those networks. So that will definitely be an interesting dynamic as we come into this. But just back to that original statement of, not just, millions and millions of devices connected, but, tens of billions of devices connected to that network, that changes the dynamic, and it changes the expectation of us as a consumer, whether we be, at the consumer level, the enterprise level, or the industrial level to connect to that network.
I want to intersect your experience in the space into the conversation a little more granularly again. You have a lot of experience in international telecom deployments as well. For some context to our audience, you began your path in the industry with sales management in Asia, and then over the years have participated in many industry events based out of Asia, but more specifically based out of Japan over the last 25 years. So if we hone into Japan to get a bit of that global context, right now they have three main players leading the 5G charge: NTT Docomo, KDDI, and SoftBank, and they all launched their 5G networks almost days apart. It was literally one after the other in a matter of 3 to 5 days in March of 2020. So since then, it's been about a year. How are 5G rollouts shaping up in Japan compared to in the United States? And what learning lessons can we take from how they've maneuvered integration and any bandwidth challenges for as we continue to maneuver our own?
Sure. So in Japan specifically, I would probably rank them behind the United States in terms of how broad those networks have been deployed. They are starting to do some initial 5G rollouts, but actually, in comparison to what we are seeing, particularly in the U.S. and in China, Japan's a little bit behind in terms of timing. I would say, anywhere from 6 to 12 months. So Japan is certainly an interesting case. If you look at the average price the Japanese consumer pays for 4G service, it's dramatically lower than the US. And by dramatically, it's anywhere from 40 to 70% cheaper for a comparable data plan / voice plan in Japan on 4G than it is in the US. So the economics are a bit different there. Certainly the densities are very high in the major Japanese cities. But it is a very different economic environment. So they are slower to deploy it just because of, I think, that economic differential, which is very similar in Europe. Again, the European cost of connectivity is much lower than it is in the U.S. So it does have a driver, I think, economically as to how fast the Japanese will deploy those networks. But that being said, what's interesting is aside from the companies you mentioned, NTT, KDDI, and SoftBank, Rakuten, which is a Japanese analog to Amazon, is launching its own 5G network, but on a very different type of platform. So Rakuten is going to be deploying what they call an Open RAN network, which is essentially for lack of a better word, a white box type of network that uses common components and common software that will be much less expensive to deploy than other closed type networks that you see from some of the other major OEMs in the space from an equipment standpoint. So Rakuten is going to really drive a very different model there. So that will be interesting to see how that open RAN, that open network type structure develops in Japan over time, which implies kind of a lower cost network deployment and potentially a bit of a change there to the economics that might exist. So, I think it's hard to say, how we learn from those challenges on that build out, because it is a little bit slower than what we've seen in some other markets. But clearly Japan, will be, one of the top 3 players in the 5G rollout space. It may take a little more time for that to get going, but if you look at who is really focused on 5G deployment now across the globe, clearly it's the U.S., China, and Japan. They're the ones that will be definitely leading the pack, and we'll probably have a lot to learn as that starts to coalesce, and we see some hard and concrete developments coming out of that particular rollout.
And let's look over at China as well. I wish I had some more information here to tee you up, but it's safe to say China is definitely trying to make its technological dependence on U.S. supply chains less so. We've seen that over the years, and I think part of that is going to be developing and launching a lot of their own proprietary 5G networks and trying to do everything from designing to manufacturing and integrating that within a Chinese only manufacturing hub and supply chain. So with that in mind, how are we seeing 5G rollouts impact the Chinese market? And are there any learning lessons for what has worked or hasn't worked there that we can also take to our budding industry here in the U.S.?
Sure. It's an interesting dynamic. And irrespective of some of the trade tensions that exist currently with China that, we have had the back and forth on over certainly the last number of years between the governments, it has really shifted the dynamic from one of more of a global type of platform rollout for 5G to one that tends to be more insular. And by that, I mean, with all of the restrictions, with the tariffs, with the technology transfer restrictions that have been put in place going into China, they have really had to shift gears. And by that, whether it's from the silicon, that is to say the processors, the power amplifiers, all of that board level silicon that goes into building a 5G network to, all of the equipment that goes into the site that enables 5G, China's having to really find their own path. They're not allowed to use silicon from a Broadcom, from a Qualcomm, from an NGX. It's been very restricted. So I think that you'll see China really home grow its own 5G. They have very big companies that are providing hardware for that are indigenous to China. But I do think you'll see some variation in terms of what that technology looks like, just because of the fact that the technology really has been clamped down in terms of what we have here on the U.S. side and supply side that could be going to China. So what does that mean? I think it means that China will very aggressively develop its own 5G network. They will be very aggressive in putting their 5G supply base in place and growing that to be a very much a homegrown type of structure without reliance on exterior supply. It will certainly follow still some of that 5G sort of basic precepts in terms of the technology, but it will be, they'll have their own variant of that. And that's going to be interesting to see how it develops and what they are able to do, certainly in terms of that network deployment. China is very aggressive at expanding into this. They're pushing very hard for their own indigenous equipment manufacturers to come up to speed. And I think ultimately they will. So, it'll create a divergence. And then separately, what does that really mean for the rest of the world? I think China will partner with certain parts of the world very effectively. They will continue to expand their flavor and certainly their equipment base of 5G across certain nationalities and environments. And that'll be interesting to see as well, as it sort of competes with the US/European version of 5G. So it is going to be a bit of a horse race there, I think, for some time. But I think that ultimately, China will, if not lead 5G, they will be at the forefront of 5G development, just because they recognize the benefits of the network. They recognize the need to have that and to be a technological leader in the space. So, it's a very different environment than it was, 4 to 5 years ago. So that's going to be an interesting development to watch and see what happens as they really start to deploy their 5G networks across China.
So taking all of that into account and weighing some of the impacts of 5G on businesses, on end users, etc., I feel like sometimes the domino effects of something like 5G, of a total network overhaul, are kind of hard to visualize beyond some of the immediate improvements to data speed and the business cases for, yes, this speed will create efficiency in this way. Sometimes there are a few things, 3 or 4 dominoes down the line that can also be incredibly impactful, but that are harder to see on first glance. So do you have any surprising use cases that really illustrate the scope of 5G's impact and how domino effects start to build on each other and create a total transformation?
Sure. Maybe just to go to sort of a very baseline type of use case. And by baseline, something that would not be, normally what you'd think about, right? When you think about streaming Netflix in 4K, that's kind of an obvious use case, right? But there are some that I think are very unique. And I'll use an example on some projects that we worked on with some of our customers on a 5G test bed. And this actually was enabling a very interlinked 5G system for a hog farm. And this hog farm was set up where the farm structure and one of our big telecommunications partners provided this, built out an entirely censored network system for a hog farm. And they had multiple drones that were always in flight, monitoring where the hogs were in pens, where they were in loading docks, where they were in feed stations. They were monitoring temperatures across all of both animal as well as feed areas. They were looking at, water discharge and, what the effluent water quality was coming out of the hog pens. They were monitoring, almost real time food intake and weight of the hogs. So if you think about all of the things you would need to raise an animal, right, and raise an animal from small to large. Whether that be temperature in the pens, whether that be the amount of food going into the pens, measuring the quality of water going into the pens, measuring data where you're looking at the hogs from a bird's eye view, making sure that you don't have some getting out, you don't have some creating problems with other ones. It was just a really overlaid system of both sensors and visual monitoring that you would never think about before. And so, it really can touch many of these aspects where, literally the farm that they deployed this on, there was a network operations center that the farmer was using every day in, day out, to monitor all of those things I just mentioned and more. I mean, I'm not covering everything they were doing, but certainly every aspect of raising that animal as a business was really networked into this entire 5G structure. So, you think about something as simple as well, it's not simple because it is hard work, and doing that is certainly something that takes a lot of knowledge and expertise. But something as simple as a farm can really benefit from all of these impacts of 5G, and I think be able to really start thinking about that ubiquity of use case that could apply even to the most simple of things that we might think about. Not a Netflix and not a self-driving car, and not a self-driving excavator at a construction site, but really just into the basics. So it is an example, I think, of how broad this network could potentially be, and how it's going to just touch every aspect of our lives here. Certainly in North America and across the planet.
Zach, I really appreciate your insights so far. And as we wrap up the conversation, what I want to do is intersect Amphenol a little bit more and get a lay of the land for how your company is playing into this 5G rollout and some of the ways that you're trying to stay ahead of the trends and be a major player in new integrations. So what do you see as Amphenol's central role in helping craft this 5G future? And what role are players like Amphenol, in your opinion, needing to play to support 5G?
Sure. So, we're in a very unique position from an Amphenol perspective. We're the largest manufacturer of small form factor antennas that go into wearables and handsets. That antenna that goes into the device that you hold in your hand and you use every day, that's what's enabling that communication path. And that communication path goes from the phone over the wireless airwaves, over radio frequency, to the devices that receive and transmit that signal. We're very deeply embedded in all of those devices, from both the RF side, but as well the high speed side and into the power side, that enable the radios that will allow 5G to connect. At those sites that transmit, we build all the cables that carry the signals, whether they be optical or RF, and into the enclosures. We build all of the physical enclosures that hold the equipment that provides that signal and that connects to the optical backbone network that goes into the data centers. In the data centers, we provide all the interconnectivity and the high density racks and frames, as well as transmission devices, optical transceivers that move that data around. So, we are very deep in the network on all aspects, from, the point where you as a consumer are receiving a signal at your handset, to, all the way back to the data center where all of those ones and zeros are moving around in optical transmission to get that data back to where it needs to go. So we're really very deep in that. And then separately, all of the sensors that go into that 5G world, whether they're, temperature sensors, speed sensors, pressure sensors, all the stuff that you're utilizing to measure that data, humidity sensors in a washer dryer, all that stuff, we're really playing to enable all of these different use cases that come up in that space, whether it be in the consumer's home, whether it be in an enterprise, building setting, whether it be in industry, whether it be in farming. So we really have just a broad range of endpoint applications and products that fit into that 5G world that connects everything. So it is I think we're in a very unique space for that. And I think I would be remiss to say that in a 5G network, there won't be something that doesn't touch an Amphenol product on a daily basis. It would just, we're so broad in the sense that we cover all of those potential use cases, and we have all the products that fit into that. It'll be just a very broad footprint in electronics. And this is all enabled by electronics. And, we're one of the largest players in electronic interconnect and sensing that exists on the planet today. So really puts us in the forefront in a lot of ways to be able to be a part of crafting that 5G future.
As we continue to look ahead, even with the wide coverage we already see from T-Mobile's 5G and coming expansion from Verizon and AT&T, what challenges to widespread adoption still exist? Anything from infrastructure to regulatory issues to market challenges, supply chain challenges, whatever you're seeing that's still impacting widespread adoption. And then with that, what kind of impact is this then having on the utility of 5G, and where does Amphenol fit in trying to overcome any of these issues?
Sure. I think, the widespread adoption really is, how broadly the network can get built and how quickly it can get built. It is still a very physical process to put equipment out in the field and to have the teams of contractors at the service provider level that have to do this. So, it's really a speed of deployment. I think, will somewhat gate the widespread adoption. The handsets and the chipsets are already available from the manufacturers to be able to deploy this at the consumer level. There's always a question of, how much of this COVID world we've lived in for, the past bit of time has impacted that deployment. But I do think that, once those networks are really start to get deployed on a broader scale, I don't think it's an adoption of the 5G technology. It's more just getting the network built. Once the network's built, the equipment will flow in terms of both the devices as well as what will enable, for example, the smart factory of the future, and that'll really happen. I don't see that there will be any reticence to the adoption of 5G. Certainly, there's been a lot of rhetoric bouncing around in areas where 5G is. People think 5G is bad and it's evil and it's causing all these negative things. But the reality is that just is not the case. And, the reality of 5G is something that it is a safe platform for telecommunications. It is one that will be adopted very broadly as the network gets built out. And I think that it will be something that we see over time, really replacing that 4G network. And, I think 2 to 3 years down the road, you won't know a person who doesn't have a 5G connection. That's just where we're going to be. So I think it's more just getting that network built and getting the devices and the utility applications and all the enabled equipment out into the field to take advantage of the network.
All right, Zach, we're going to close the conversation with a final hot take. So get opinionated with me here. What's your biggest and boldest prediction about the impact of 5G moving forward, and why?
So my biggest prediction and boldest prediction on 5G is that I think it will be something that will touch every aspect of our lives at every minute of the day. It is so broad. It is so scope delimited in terms of what it can do and what it can connect to, that it will just be a part of everything we do as we go forward. And that's a very broad and bold prediction, but the reality is that they're just, I wouldn't say, obviously you couldn't say that there's an infinite number of use cases, but I would say there's a Googleplex of use cases that clearly will allow just things to happen that we've not even envisioned today on a network that is truly optimized for the next few decades. And that will be something that really impacts every aspect of our daily lives as a consumer. That impacts every aspect of our daily lives in business. That impacts every aspect of our daily lives, in everything we do. So I know that's a broad and very wide scope, but I think back to what we talked about earlier. I have a very difficult time not thinking of something where 5G couldn't have an impact. I just can't come up with it, and I've thought about it a lot. So I really do think it is going to be something that just touches every aspect of everyday life that people don't even think about today.
I love the big picture analysis, and I think I'm going to have to agree there. I think as we look at 5G and the way that different industries are preparing for its use, it really signals that most every industry is beginning to identify, yes, 5G is going to be beneficial to my operations. And I think end users aren't going to pass up 5G connectivity, especially at a cost-effective price point. So with all of that in mind, I think we are going to continue to see 5G proliferated at a scale that maybe folks didn't even expect. And as we maneuver that, we're going to continue our conversations and continue to judge the state of 5G's rollout, where the opportunities are, where it's suffering, and what Amphenol can do to help fill the gap there. Thank you so much, Zach, for your insights today. It's really been a pleasure. Again, we've been chatting with Zak Raley. He's Senior Vice President at Amphenol. He was also recently inducted to the Cable TV Hall of Fame, 25 years in the industry. Zach, it's really been a pleasure today. Thank you.
Great, Daniel. Thanks so much. Appreciate your time.
And real quick, before we close out, if folks want to find out more about how Amphenol is supporting 5G rollouts, learn more about your tech, or just get in touch, how can they do so?
Sure. You can look at our website, www.amphenol.com. We have a number of aspect points to 5G that you can learn about and really drill into all the application-specific solutions that we've got in the space. I encourage people to have a look at that and certainly can go to that area and learn a little bit more about what touches this next generation of the communications network.
Perfect. Zak Raley, thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Daniel.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to today's episode of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. If you like what you heard and want to listen to previous episodes, make sure that you're heading to our website, amphenolbroadband.com. Again, amphenolbroadband.com. And make sure that you're subscribing to Wavelengths on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. Till next time.